Hello everyone, so welcome to the last panel. If anyone hasn't met me, I'm Rachel Neal and I am one of Liz's and Sonia's colleagues here in Design Cultures at Montfort University, so lovely to meet you. We are now in the final panel, which is called Remaking Histories in Archives and Heritage Sites. And we've got 3 speakers today. And our first speaker here is Ellie Birchall. And Ellie Birchall is a recent graduate at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, presenting her undergraduate dissertation titled A Sociological Exploration of the Wearing of Period Clothing and Challenging Historical Preconceptions in Scottish Heritage Sites. Her research interests include costumed interpretation, museum learning, and memory studies. And this afternoon, she's presenting her paper called A Sociological Exploration of the Wearing of Period Clothing and Challenging Preconceptions in Scottish Heritage Sites.
Thank you. I'm not going to repeat the title again, don't worry, mainly because it's so long. But just to start off by saying my undergraduate degree was in psychology and sociology, so that's the kind of lens that I'm coming at this from. So my research aim was to explore the lived experience of costumed interpreters' practice and wearing of period clothing in Scottish heritage sites. And these are my research questions. I'll let you read them, but I thought of these as throughout visiting heritage sites through my life with costumed interpreters, I find that they often talk about the way that clothing is made because they obviously have a further appreciation of it. And I wanted to see if they spoke directly about clothing relating to gender roles as well. And I should say, I define costume interpretation as the practice of wearing reconstructed or styled historical clothing, whilst either facilitating tours, talks, workshops, etc. in heritage sites. So first of all, I of course did a literature review. So these were the main points. So I have learning in museums, the sociological study of clothing, costumed interpretation, and memory and gendered memories of labour, which I'm going to go into more detail. So the first thing I looked at was museum learning, which I thought was really important because heritage sites and museums are thought of as educational spaces. So I think it's really important to consider how all visitors learn, so that's children, adults, and people of different abilities as well. Previous research has shown that visitors want a lot of the hands-on activities and discussion time with professionals so that they can ask questions and reconstruct their own learning. And which is of course different from kind of typical exhibitions which have the object or the reconstructed object and the labels. So although these are really important, they kind of assume a certain level of education, age, understanding, and therefore cultural capital. We're going to go into sociology. So throughout this, I argued that costume interpretation is a way of experiencing the past and a way that we can adapt to these things that the visitors want, as well as allowing different abilities and allow museums to become more accessible. So costume interpretation has taken place in North America and Sweden since about the 1860s, but was first introduced in the UK in 1996 at the Jorvik Viking Centre in York, and is often viewed in a lot of sociology academic study as frivolous, which is why it's not maybe as discussed as much, along with kind of sociology of clothing generally. There are 2 types of costume interpretation that I've come across. So this first person, where the interpreters act as though they're living in the past, and they kind of will come up to you and be like, what is that in your hand, pointing to your phone, and what does it do? But there's also third person, where they're still dressed in historical clothing, but they'll be giving talks and using more modern language and anecdotes. Although not a lot of research has taken place in the practice, which I think is because of a lack of understanding of the importance of entertainment along with education, research that has taken place has found that it's really engaging and again accessible as well. And typically the research taking place is quantitative until a PhD thesis in Canada by Oberg in 2021 did a qualitative study with costume interpreters, which has inspired a lot of my study as well. So a lot of these points in my lit review did come through in my findings as well, so there's a lot of overlap there as well, just to say. So visitor preconceptions and cultural memory is another point in my lit review. So often visitors now more than ever come into heritage sites with preconceptions, often of the time period, history, and sometimes the functionality of clothing from TV shows such as Bridgerton. And I'm going to talk about Braveheart as well, coming from Scotland. So yeah, this is also considered as cultural memory, which I have a definition here. So cultural memory is defined as the study of narratives of past events which are maintained through institutions and culture, and therefore reinforced by professionals such as priests, museum professionals, and education people. Again, this often comes from the media, but cultural memory can also be carried in heritage sites themselves and objects, both from the time and reconstructed, so things like clothing as well. There's a researcher called Nora who also contends that memory's heightened discourse kind of comes from scarcity as well. So memory sites function as artificial placeholders, as she says, for the no longer existent natural collective memory. And it can therefore be concluded that heritage sites and historical objects may also be conceptualized as heritage sites. So the next part I'm going to talk about is the sociological study of clothing. So as we've heard throughout all the talks so far, it's a symbolic entity, so it can show someone's gender, occupation, class, sexuality, where they come from, period of time, etc. But more recently, the object turn in sociology has focused on objects as kind of foundational to the way social life is experienced. So it aids socialization, social control, or even shows breaking free from cultural restraints, which has led to actor network theory by Leicester in 2005, which shows that human history can kind of be related to our relationships with objects. So we've got the Industrial Revolution, for example. It's also been proposed that objects, and therefore clothing, have the ability to act and affect us from effect theory. So the theory of effect investigates dressing as sort of an embodied practice and represents the relationship of covering the body, so the way it affects us by allowing us to stand a certain way, posture, if we're talking about historical clothing, but also have a sense of elegance, for example, wearing high heels, or very similar as well. But we can also affect clothing in turn as well, so by adding adornments such as extra symbols or ripping it, etc. It's also been said off the back of that clothing itself can carry memory. So this is from Woodward and Narada. So memories can also be carried. For example, I wore this jacket last time I gave a conference talk, so it kind of carries that memory and the fact that I've done this before, so it might be okay as well. But it can also carry cultural memory, like I was saying, so memories of the past. So gendered memories of labour is the main cultural memory I talk about throughout my dissertation. So it allows minority groups' perceptions to be considered, things that are often erased from kind of textbook history. And it kind of shows that collective identity is a really important part in remembering, but also things that are obviously forgotten as well. And it means that we can uncover that. The cultural memory of female labour is also carried and demonstrated within heritage sites when we can talk about it or kind of uncover these histories as well. And likewise, when people are reconstructing clothing and showing the clothing worn, that we can talk about the way it was made and the idea that women have often been solely the people to take care of clothing in domestic spaces. Kind of find where I am. Yeah, so throughout history, kind of seamstresses and garment makers have usually been acknowledged as subjects worthy of sympathy in art and textiles. However, their work and their lives are not really considered notable, and because a lot of domestic female labour is in the home, it is kind of blurred boundaries, and that's why, well, one reason why it is not shown as much. So now to get on to what I actually did. So I did semi-structured interviews, often in the heritage sites in which my participants worked. I did 6 interviews, and I had an optional object-based interview, which meant that they either were wearing the clothing or had it next to us, so that it could be used as a memory prompt and they could touch it. Like I also really wanted to see it, obviously, but they could touch it and recall memories that way. And then I analysed it through interpretive phenomenological analysis, which basically means I recorded it and then listened to it, developed themes and sub-themes, but it was mainly on them making sense of their experience and me making sense of their experience and how they're making sense of their experience. So these were my participants. So I have the 2 on either end from History Matters Limited, who display medieval 11th to 17th centuries, and they belong to a lot of different heritage sites throughout Scotland, and I think they travel around a lot as well. And then I have the Crannog Centre, so I had 2 participants from there, and they are in Perthshire, and it obviously displays the Iron Age. And then I have Boriston Castle in Edinburgh, which displays the 18th century, and I think they're really an interesting case because the participant, that's not actually reconstructed clothing, that's modern clothing that they've researched and styled to look historical because of lack of funding and things like that. But I think it's still really effective. So my findings, what were they? So the first theme is learning and engagement in heritage sites. So first of all, I have the notion of immersive experience, which again, participants were really very passionate about creating an immersive experience when they're working, and were very successful in doing this from what they were saying and their visitor feedback as well. They kind of reflected on the idea that bringing the clothing to life by wearing it makes them themselves and also the visitors further appreciate the clothing worn, so they can see it move, how it feels to wear it every day, and they could also talk about that as well. It means that they could also talk about the production quality of clothing as well. Another important part of this is that, especially in the Crannog Centre, they could talk about sustainable attitudes towards clothing and how it's changed now, which is fast fashion. So they're bridging a lot of the past and the present together, which is really important now because we're wanting to go back to more sustainable attitudes, and we can maybe take some ideas from them. Again, education and entertainment combined along with an immersive experience makes it more accessible to different ages and abilities, as well as challenging the historical perceptions, but also the preconception of uncertainty. So especially within the Crannog Centre, obviously we don't know a lot about the Crannog Centre generally and about Iron Age generally. So they found that visitors attribute more value once they've kind of had an immersive experience and lived and worked in a way, because they also host workshops where you get to make jewellery, leatherwork, and the clothing and stuff as well, which is really interesting. There's one quote from one of the ladies I interviewed there, and she says a visitor basically said to her, "For God's sake, Hen, I didn't know that they had all this in the Iron Age. I mean, it's like their own wee world, which she was like, it absolutely is, yeah. And again, this kind of preconception of uncertainty as well, if I go back to the Lauriston Castle one. So actually, the previous owner was called Mrs. Reed, and she knew that when she died, her house was going to be donated to the state. So she actually burned all of her possessions. So we don't know a lot about her life personally. So what they do know is a lot about the 18th century. So they would obviously talk about like women's right movement and that she might have been involved, etc. But they can't say for sure, which is really interesting. So the second theme is effective role of elements and the role of materials in practice. So a lot of the participants told me that they carry personal memories within the clothing. So a lot of them are obviously heavily involved in the construction of the clothing. So they also remember kind of like when they first put it on as well, if they helped make it, if they made it, etc. And that this can kind of highlight like the embodied experience of wearing the period clothing as well. So again, they know how it feels to live and work in the clothing, just as people throughout history did. For example, in Lauriston Castle, the lady of the house would know, like, she would have to have like lots of help to walk up the stairs in her long gowns, and similarly the maids would be carrying really, really heavy things up the stairs. And when they are recreating that, they can kind of get a sense of how that feels. Again, it's also because of the embodied experience, the surprise actually from the people that it is actually really comfortable. So there's another quote by one of the history masters, limited people, that said it's actually very comfortable. I've been wearing it for 14 years, and people look at me a bit strangely, but I'm actually quite happy wearing them. They're surprisingly warm in the winter and a lot cooler in the summer, and it also means that I don't get sunburn, although I do get a funny tan on my face. And as well is the theme of authenticity. So the participants felt that they gave a better experience when their clothing was authentic. So the lady from Lauriston Castle did kind of mention that although that they did a lot of research in styling this modern clothing, she felt she'd be able to give a better experience if she had reconstructed clothing, because she did say she got a lot of it from Marks and Spencer's, which I was very surprised at. But also important to add, it's obviously very difficult with funding and cuts, etc. So that's why we need to do research and things like that. So the third theme, which is the last theme, is the knowledge of period clothing communicated to visitors. So that is the construction of clothing. A lot of you obviously know a lot more about that than I do. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. But again, it's like the methods and materials that would have been used in the past, adornments, as well as things like colour as a class symbol. So in the Iron Age, it showed where people came from. So pink was not a very common colour. It could only be found in certain likings in the Cairngorms and in Devon. So if you had that, it showed that that's where you came from, or that you were just wealthy enough to somehow get it to yourself. There's also, of course, red, which represents royalty, and having the Scottish coat of arms, for example, shows that you're representing the king or queen at the time, as well as the gendered memory of work. So the wearing, carrying, and construction of period clothing can also carry that cultural memory of gendered labour. Again, women throughout history responsible for carrying, making, and mending clothes. However, this is kind of different in the Crannog Centre because we don't actually know whether the gender roles would have taken place, like women in the home, men out working. It might have been completely the other way around. And at one point they did have their textile specialist was a man, so it was kind of challenging these preconceptions as soon as you walked into the Crannog. So these are my conclusions. So I revealed the complex ways costumed interpreters make sense of their role from the analysis of participants' accounts. It was found that costumed interpreters in this study were all passionate about making the experience of visiting heritage sites immersive, so visitors would be able to further appreciate the historical events, clothing, places, etc. And the practitioners in the study also discussed how clothing facilitates an immersive experience, building on the work of Malcolm Davies in 2007. Practitioners in the study also talk about how they challenge historical preconceptions of visitors, including that of uncertainty. I have some implications for practice here, but I think further research could be either on talking about costume interpretation, acknowledging other minorities' experiences, and if that actually happens. But I'd also like to talk about more immersive experience of when, for example, you get to try on reconstructed period clothing in different heritage sites and museums as well. So yeah, these are some references. That's me.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Thank you. That was really interesting. So, I'll take us on to our second one. So, where are we?
I've got a backup if you need it. This is the point at which I discover it was corrupted in the email.
Looks like we can. All right, I'll just get this ready for you.
Yes, it has it actually.
Go on.
If you can indulge me, I am plunging us back into darkness.
Good job.
Yeah, it has been corrupted. Can I give you my PDF version of it?
Oh, it is corrected, yes.
Yeah.
Of course.
So that should be that one.
Let me find you. See this?
Mm-hmm.
Can I just drag and drop? Is that all right?
Yep, go for it.
Wonderful. Just building the tension. And I'll introduce you.
Thank you very much.
All right, do you want to take over that and I'll give you a quick introduction? All right. So, we've got our second speaker here. We've got Becky Mail with us here. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Becky Mail has been a volunteer with Glasgow Women's Library for over 5 years, focusing on their knitting patterns and women's history. She's given the talks live and on and off the needle in the 20th century about Glasgow Women's History, Glasgow Women's Library, patterns, and also women's counter-cultural creativity in conjunction with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So Becky's presenting her paper this afternoon on knitting the woman's woolly. Got to say that right?
Yep.
A creative archive response. Over to you, Becky.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so like I said, you said in the introduction, I've been with the Women's Library for about 5.5 years now, doing knitting patterns, but also doing a few other things. I'm an independent researcher, but I also quite like the term para-academic. Someone who's engaged in academic research and engaged in and with academic research, but is out with traditional academic institutions. Before we go any further, I do want to stress this is all my own research, and I'm not speaking on behalf of Glasgow Women's Library today. I'm probably going to say we and our at various points when talking about GWL, but that's more habit than anything else. But, brief introduction to Glasgow Women's Library. It was founded in 1991 and emerged from the celebrations of Glasgow being named the European City of Culture. The artists and activists on the ground noticed that there was a lot of focus on male artists and the culture of men in Scotland and in Glasgow. So it really was a grassroots project. I think it was like 10 years before anyone actually got paid. And because of that, volunteers have always been a really important part of how the library operates. It's the only accredited museum in the UK dedicated to women's history and lives, and the museum collection is recognised as a nationally significant collection by the Scottish Government. All of the books and objects are donated. There's no acquisitions budget. All of the books are by or about women. So, if anyone's got a book about and wants to send it our way, be my guest. But as a result of that, the collection reflects parts of women's history that the donors themselves viewed worth preserving. In 2013, we moved to the former Carnegie Library in Bridgeton in the East End of Glasgow. If you're up that way at any point, come and visit. We also have hybrid events. It's a really lovely, warm space to come and visit. One of the things we've had a lot of donated are copies of the feminist magazine Spare Rib. To the degree that we're having to turn them away, and we have boxes in the basement that we're literally selling off because we have so many. Founded in 1972, it attempted to be a women's magazine that embraced women's liberation. It sold on shelves in newsagents alongside other women's magazines and was ad-supported. But finding what that identity as a women's magazine was took a while. So in building that identity, they were faced with the complexities of making. In the early 1970s, there's this movement towards anti-capitalist self-sufficiency. So there's a lot of crafting in that period. But at the same time, second wave feminism was attempting to liberate women from domesticity. So there's this conflict there in the magazine very early on between these two strands. One way they grappled with this was their regular spare parts feature, which taught women to do things out with the usual skill set provided by women's magazines. This one here is on how to prep walls for painting, stenciling, wall coverings, that sort of thing. It only lasted until issue 25 in 1974. One of the founders has subsequently said that they don't think they necessarily got that balance between domesticity and liberation right. She was specifically talking about cooking and food, but I'd argue that it also applies to this as well. And there was almost an overcompensation in the magazine to push craft out in an attempt to liberate women. I also need to give credit to Dr. Alison Main for her research into crafting in Spare Rib, because her work has been incredibly useful. However, in 1982, they published their last piece on knitting, which is the pattern for the women's woolly. My copy of it, by the way, is down in the front if you want to come and have a flick through the magazine. It was suggested right back when I joined Glasgow Women's Library, I think it was literally the first conversation I had with the curator, is that I might like to make something for the archive. And whilst I was fully on board with that, for me it had to be the right object. It needed to say something that was relevant both to the women's library and to the history of women in craft. I didn't want to make something just because it was fun and pretty. It needed to be impactful, and that was this pattern. So the Women's Woolly project has these two streams to it. The first one being the jumper for the archive, which I then followed up with a jumper for me. At the same time, I was working on the blog posts and then subsequently turned it into a podcast. Both, like I said, I think both of these are creative responses in their own right. So for the archive, I wanted to do a recreation for the archive as close as possible to the written pattern as I could, using the contemporary sources to choose my techniques. The jumper for me, I wanted to make using my preferred modern techniques and updated to reflect my feminism and trends in modern knitting and yarns. The blog post for the website, I genuinely thought when I started it was just going to be this short little thing about what I did and how I did it, and as it progressed, it became 4 blog posts and came in about 7,000 words. I've also, and I recorded it as a podcast, because one of the things Women's Library is very big on is accessibility, because frankly, not everyone's got time or the ability to sit down and read all of that. So it's a 45-minute podcast. It's on the Women's Library feed if you want something to listen to this evening. The QR code and the link both go to the same place if you'd like to have a little read. Today, I'm mostly going to focus on the creation of the jumpers and why this has been a successful volunteer project, rather than going into that deeper context that I was uncovering. but that's very much all there in the blog post if you'd like to have a read. So this is the original as it's given in the pattern, and this is my version. For me, this isn't just a jumper, right? It's a physical representation of the language of knitting to display to people and to demonstrate to people what this jumper is. It's an interpretation of the language of knitting for people that don't necessarily knit. I'll come back to some of the technical choices in a bit, but right now I just want to draw your attention to the yarn and the colour. These are actually the three colours given in the pattern: the navy, the burgundy, and the light grey. But I mean, in black and white photo, you can't see them, and you definitely can't see this burgundy ridge, which is such a lovely detail. Like, that's not visible in the black and white pattern. I did make one tiny mistake in making this. So the pattern gives the tension for the jumper as an Aran weight, but specifies a DK yarn. I read the tension and not the specification. So the yarn I used is about 25% thicker than given. It actually hasn't made a difference to the sizing. All that changes is the drape. The reason I left it is that I felt that if I, with all of my knitting experience, made that mistake, there is a very good chance somebody at the time did as well. When I dug a little deeper into the pattern, the designer unfortunately used a pseudonym, and I can't find anywhere else that they used the same one. But the photographer is a different matter. If you're familiar with any of Jill Posner's work, it's probably this one, which was featured in her book on political graffiti, Spray It Loud, which was released later in 1982. This was also recently in the Tate exhibition, Women in Revolt, with a few of her other works. But yeah, so 1982, she's publishing this book. 1982, she also takes these photos. So she's obviously working on this book at the same time she's doing these photos for Spare Rib. As I analysed them, there's a subtle queerness to the pictures that became apparent that I decided to then go on and implement more in my jumper, in the second jumper. The text, by the way, on the wall is a punchline to a joke. The setup goes, "My mother made me a homosexual." Yeah, if I gave her the wall, would she make me one too? The model's short hair, minimal makeup and jewellery, simple white shirt, unisex jeans, are, I argue, what Betty Luther Hillman identified as the uniform of lesbian feminists of the period. They rejected femininity in fashion to be ugly and therefore free of the pressures of male desire. And in doing so, their anti-fashion became its own fashion. So, yeah, there's a lot more going on in these images than just the jumper. But to talk about the jumper itself, I'd argue it's much less subversive. With the exception of the Venus band, frankly, it could have come out of any pattern book of the period. It's pretty unremarkable. It's knitted flat, and then you seam it all together, and then you pick up the neckline stitches down the front and round the back, and I absolutely despise that because you're basically knitting an oval in a straight line. Do not recommend. But this is also different to those spare parts features. In fact, there's no teaching going on. This pattern assumes you know how to knit. It's not going to teach you how to do it. And it's written very sparsely. I'd argue that this jumper itself is almost analogous to the Spare Rib magazine. Both are attempting to be radical within the context of their forms, one in publishing, the other in knitting, but without ever pushing that form any further. Due in part to the influence of the internet, there's a lot more techniques that are widely known today than there were in 1982. So I went back into the GWL archives to find reference books from the period to choose my techniques. This is just the table I made to keep track of the differences between the two. Some of these are personal preferences, like the decreases. Frankly, nothing terribly exciting about that. That's just my personal foibles. But I do want to highlight a few. So I used a long tail cast on because of the ones I found in the sources, it's the stretchiest. And very rarely do you see backstitch anymore, given as a way to seam. It's always something like mattress or or something different to that. And then the other thing is the decision to press versus block. So, and actually we heard about this in the stockings, the blocking, you wash something and then you stretch it out afterwards. Pressing in this instance means you iron the pieces. Very much all of modern knitting, like you're told to block it. You're never told to press it anymore. So the iron is now completely absent from knitting. Where the jumper, though, can claim to be radical is the pockets. Something so wildly simple but missing from so many women's clothes. Their absence from many 20th and 21st century clothes can be summarised by the additional cost and complexity for manufacturers, the ubiquity of the handbag, and the belief of designers that bulging pockets are frankly unflattering. But in making this jumper, the knitter can choose to prioritise their own needs over an aesthetic ideal and become, in effect, their own designer by taking dominion over their own pockets and what goes in them, which I think probably makes that the most feminist part of this jumper. These are just a couple of shots so you can see the Venus band in a bit more detail. You can see the shoulder seam and the top of the sleeves. So, part 2. The archive jumper complete, I moved on to my jumper. I will take this off afterwards and put it on the table and let you have a closer look at it. Or you could just come and stare at me afterwards, I don't mind. So the pattern actually gives 2 versions. It gives the sleeved and the sleeveless, which it refers to as a pullover, so I went with the sleeveless. I get quite reflective in the blog about my own relationship with my body, with clothes, and with colour. And in reading that back several months on, I realised that what I described fits quite well into the concept of lesbian camp. Although usually ascribed to gay men, lesbian camp also exaggerates heteronormative depictions to the point of absurdity, as Neal phrases it, and I think this shade of pink probably almost certainly is absurd. But an important difference is that lesbian camp often requires a level of creation by the wearer, rather than the reinterpretation and the recontextualising that's often common in traditional male camp, and they quite often as well have slightly different audiences in their intent. So, for this jumper, I got to knit it how I like it. And as I mentioned, the internet's had this massive impact on just the sheer number of techniques known to us as modern knitters. The biggest and most relevant change is knitters and designers who conceptualise the garment as a 3D object, utilise that and push the medium further, which is why I adapted the pattern so it's knitted as a singular piece in the round. I mean, it's that, and I also really, really hate doing seams on knitting. Like, don't get me wrong, I love sewing, I just hate seams on knitting. Additionally, I used a modern cast-off from, I think, 2009 that was originally published in the online magazine Knitting. And I tweaked the pattern to fit slightly better across the shoulders because my bust is bigger than my shoulders are wide, and it was going to be halfway down my elbows. So whereas with the original I tried to keep it as close as possible, with my jumper I got to deviate for both my own enjoyment and my own benefit. But the materials I chose for the jumper also reflect changes in the commercial landscape of knitting. So traditionally, big brand name companies producing their own patterns. Very much a shift in the landscape now. The white and pink here are West Yorkshire Spinners, who are a medium-sized British yarn company, and were purchased from my local independent yarn shop. The multicoloured scheme was hand-dyed in Bridgeton, Glasgow, so just round the corner from the Women's Library, and was purchased at Glasgow's Yarn Fair, Glasgow School of Yarn. Local yarn shops, yarn fairs, and indie dyers are overwhelmingly businesses run by women. And they interact with each other and make space for each other and promote and complement each other. Their customers, overwhelmingly women as well, aren't engaged in the anti-capitalist crafting that characterised the 1970s, but engage in what I describe as intentional consumption in how they choose their materials. So, the other big change I made to the jumper was the Venus band. On the left here Yep, I know left and right, honest. Is the original, and on the right are my additions. A jumper for my body needs to reflect my feminist politics, a feminism that is unapologetically intersectional, or at least attempts to be. Despite the subtle queer messaging of the original, feminism's relationship to lesbians in the 70s was, let's go with complicated. So the first edition I designed was the joined Venus, a symbol of lesbianism. The next symbol is the Mercury, which has been used for both non-binary and for intersex people at various points. The third is a modern non-binary symbol, not the, there's quite a few. And the final is the widely recognised trans symbol. There are 25 Venuses on my jumper and 4 new symbols. I haven't removed the Venus, I haven't gotten rid of it. All I've done is augment it with my greater modern understanding of gender and what that can mean. So that's it. This is so you can see how they knitted up. On the test knits, the 2 on the left here, the non-binary and the trans symbol, they didn't work quite as well with the space that I had for the stranded knitting. So I did just go back in at the end and I sewed in some of the details, whereas for the Mercury and for the lesbian, they knitted up perfectly. But the other creative strand of this was the blog posts. Frankly, I could have just knitted up the jumpers, we'd have got a couple of nice posts out of it for socials, and that would be lovely. But because I took the time to write these blogs, the reach of my work has been so much greater. Frankly, I'm here today because somebody read those and sent me the call for papers and said I should apply. Genuinely, that's what happened. These blogs turned what I honestly thought was my niche special interest project, how many of us have those, into something beyond my wildest expectations. I love doing the research and the knitting, but the communication of that research to a wider audience is what has made the difference. And again, that's the QR code and the link if you want to go and have a read. But to talk about volunteering, just to finish, in order to understand why this worked as a volunteer project, I wanted to understand a little bit more about the theory behind volunteerism, so I dived into the literature. About 20 years ago, there's this shift in how we think about volunteers, away from viewing volunteers as unpaid labour in museum and heritage contexts, to the ultimate form of museum consumer, who gets backstage access to staff and collections. Now, the obvious critique of this approach is actually that volunteers go way beyond just consuming and become active producers in our own experiences and the experience of other visitors as well. There's a lot, like volunteers do a lot more than just consume. In producing the jumpers, blog posts, and frankly in being here today, Glasgow Women's Library became, as Noreen Orr puts it, a creative space where volunteers are active in appropriating their own heritage and contextualising the museum within their own lives. And frankly, if that doesn't sum up this project, I don't know what does. My advice for anyone interested in facilitating a project like this within their own institutions, frankly, I cannot stress enough the importance of good management. Volunteering isn't unpaid work, it's a leisure activity. One Australian study found that most volunteers only do between about 1 and 5 hours a week in museums. So you've got to have realistic expectations. This project took me a whole year. Now, admittedly, I took the summer off because, frankly, nobody wants to read about jumpers in a July heatwave. But that does mean that, because I was trusted by our volunteer coordinator to manage my own work, and I wasn't being hounded with, when's it going to be done and when's it going to be ready, I did it at my own pace, and as a result, I got to dig a lot deeper into the sources and produce something that I'd argue is probably better as a result. Having a community of staff and volunteers around me who, even if they weren't knitters, were enthusiastic about my nerdy special interest project made me feel like my work was important. As a volunteer, my work mattered to them. An enhanced learning experience is more than just training and new skills. I mean, it can be that. I took all the photographs, which is something I learned to do through being part of Glasgow Women's Library. It's also the freedom to explore and follow your own interests. And frankly, I followed it all the way here today, so that's pretty cool. So I want to thank you for having me here today and listening to me. The QR code goes to all my sources if you want to have a look at them, and I think I've also put a link to that in my socials. I also want to thank Gabrielle Macbeth and Dr. Adele Patrick at Glasgow Women's Library, who have been so supportive and so enthusiastic about me doing all of this. And also the Passold Research Fund, who gave me a grant so I could come here, which is really wonderful. So thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Becky. All right, I'll just get us ready for our final speaker of the panel. Well, whilst Caitlin's setting up, I'll introduce her to you all. So our final speaker for the afternoon is Caitlin Sheldon. So Caitlin Sheldon is a public librarian who dabbles in archives, as well as a hobby historical costumer who has been costuming for 10 years. She lives in upstate New York with her partner, their Chihuahua, or suburban cryptid. Am I saying that right? Suburban cryptid.
Suburban cryptid.
That's a new one for me. And an embarrassingly large fabric stash and collections of sewing books. So I'll hand it to you. Oh, your paper, of course, let's not forget that, is connecting the public to archives through costuming. Over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Hello. So, yep, as she said, I'm a public librarian. I live and work in Saratoga Springs, New York. So I'm going to start by giving some background on Saratoga Springs because that is relevant to what I'm going to talk about. If you have heard of Saratoga Springs, it's probably because we have the oldest thoroughbred racehorse track in North America. They started racing there in about 1864. So usually if people have heard of it, this is why they've heard of it. But before that, way before, people knew Saratoga Springs for its naturally occurring mineral springs. These are freshwater, cold mineral springs that are naturally carbonated. And Saratoga is right on a fault line, so there are several different mineral springs in the area that all kind of naturally come up. And a couple of them are actual, we had one that was a geyser that is no longer there because it was depleted, but there's one that is still called the Island Spouter that kind of spouts up. And unlike Old Faithful that's out in Yellowstone National Park, the Island Spouter, it spouts just because there's so much carbonation in the water that naturally occurs. So way back when, before the 18th century, the area was hunting grounds for the Mohawk and Mohican tribes, and they were the ones that knew of the mineral springs first. After the American Revolution, all of those tribes got pushed either west or north into Canada. Many of them who had supported the British cause during the American Revolution saw, well, now the Americans are in charge and this could be bad for us, so they fled up north into Canada, and many of them are still there today. So once this area started becoming visited by more and more of the European settlers, they also started discovering these mineral springs, and to them it was like the US version of Bath. They compared it to Bath, they compared it to Spa in Belgium, and there were also, they did analyses of the waters to determine like how close it was to these different health resorts here in Europe, and kind of develop health prescriptions for the waters. So by the 19th century, you had tons and tons of rich, wealthy, high society white people coming up to Saratoga from New York City to escape the really dirty New York City streets and air and go up to Saratoga to get health treatments, to drink the waters. And
So Saratoga really became a center for tourism. Like, it was a resort town, it was a destination for tourism. So part of the benefit is that we have tons of documentary evidence of all of these people visiting Saratoga Springs, because photographs like these, this is part of a stereo view that would be put in a little viewfinder, and then it causes the image to be 3D. And they photographed and printed tons and tons and tons of these because they were sold as tourist items. So Saratoga was really an aspirational place. It was a place where people could dream of being among the high society, dream of bettering themselves and maybe finding a rich husband, things like that. There was, during the summer season, there were balls every night, there were garden parties. So we have all of these photographs, we have all of these postcards that were taken to really try to draw people to the area and to act as souvenirs for people who did visit the area. But there is a lack of documentation of people who were not rich white people, because they wanted to make sure that they could sell these to people who wanted to remember and also who have these aspirations. So we have tons of stuff, not a ton of documentation of the working class or minorities who were in Saratoga at the time. The other reason you might know Saratoga Springs is because that was where Solomon Northup was kidnapped from when he was sold into slavery, which he then famously wrote the book 12 Years a Slave about. So there were working class people of all different backgrounds in Saratoga, but what we have is the high society documentation. So in working at my library, I see all of these images in the archive. I, of course, coming from a hobby historical costume background, I'm always so inspired by all of these images of pretty dresses, and they've always made me feel more connected to the city and the history of the city and understanding the history of the city. And I finally one day got this idea of, well, what if I take one of these dresses and I go to the same place that still exists in our city and I photograph the dress in the same place, and how would that help connect people to the actual history of the city? Because we have tour groups in town that do tours all summer long. We have a history museum in town that has like almost no budget. They're not even nationally accredited. They kind of do the best they can. They grew out of a historical society that just like kind of rents the space from the city. So we do talk about the history, but I've just always gotten the sense that people aren't really seeing it as real and connected, and they don't see these as like real people. It's always like, oh, things were so much nicer and prettier and better back then. And I wanted to try to create more connection. So one of my coworkers, hearing me talk about this project, suggested, why don't you apply for a grant? We have an organization in Saratoga called Saratoga Arts that they do all kinds of arts education. They have galleries, they do artist support for artists who live in the community, and they're responsible for redistributing grants that we get from New York State to support arts funding and arts education. And they have different categories of grants. I think this part is specifically about the community arts grants, where if you're a not-for-profit organization in the community, you can apply for a grant. There's also arts education grants that specifically teachers and school programs apply to. What I applied for was an individual artist grant that is designed to allow an individual artist to build a project that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise be able to afford, so that it can both improve their sort of advance their artistic ability and their artistic visibility in the community, while also connecting them to the community through public programs that they do. So that was the one that I applied for, and I was very lucky that they chose my project to be funded with a grant that year. So then I had to go through and choose which of these images to use, because these stereo views, we have 1,400 different stereo views like this in my library's collection. There was an independent collector who, bless you, who over the years had collected all of these on his own, used it to write a book on like a visual history of Saratoga Springs. So I just had to go through and choose one. The reason I chose this one is because this structure with the little gate, it's called the reservoir. There's water in there. Sometimes there's fish in there. This is still standing in this park in the middle of Saratoga Springs. This is called Congress Park. And it still has this wrought iron scroll work around it. You can still see in that direction behind it. So it's still pretty much exactly the same as it was back then. Plus, the dress in this image is so visually striking with the different layers and the different lines. I felt that this could really stand out and help people really kind of visualize what this dress would have looked like at the time in this place. One of the choices that I wanted to make early on was that I really, really wanted to make the dress out of very bright, very vibrant, very striking colors because, of course, all of these photographs are black and white. And I always hear people talking about how kind of like stuffy and formal people were back then. And even the museums that we have in Saratoga Springs, they have some extant garments. There isn't a lot of stuff that is very bright and vibrant. And I know from looking at pictures from other collections and fashion plates that, of course, they had colors of every different hue. And people are always surprised when I would tell them that. So the first thing I wanted to make sure was that this was a very brightly colored dress. So where I started was I got promotional materials printed because it was funded with a grant. I had to print the Saratoga Arts logo on everything. And the benefit of getting the grant was that they could help me advertise it. I got their list of contacts to do press releases, so all of the local journalists and news stations, and I printed up these postcards, which I have more in my bag that I forgot to grab out, but these were all little postcards. On the reverse was the list of all of my public appearances and my contact information, so that they could find me online, and then they could find the dates and times where they could find me at different events and talk to me about the project. And I was able to hand them out at the Saratoga Arts Center. I put some out at the Saratoga Springs Visitor Center. I put some out at my library, and I just went around to all the coffee shops, like tacking them up on the bulletin boards, because the biggest part of this was that I wanted the community to see this. I wanted this to be visible. So I started with those. I also made my YouTube account at the time where I started posting progress photos, and even I made a video on how to use the apportioned scale that is in Frances Grimble's Fashions of the Gilded Age books, because that was what I used to draft my bodice for the gown. So it was very much like sharing my process as well as showing people how they could also do it, or at least teaching them about the process of how these gowns were made at the time. And as part of my community outreach, I did 2 different public working days. This was my setup at the Clifton Park Half Moon Public Library, which is a little ways south of my library and where I live. You can see at this time I had the underskirt together. You can see my jacket that I'm working on. I had like my iron, I had my I don't think I brought my sewing machine to this one, but like I had my whole setup. I was there for 2 or 3 hours, and I just had people come up and ask me questions. Most of the time, if they asked questions, it was kind of the preconceptions, like Ellie was talking about earlier, of like, oh, wasn't this so hot to wear? Wasn't it so complicated? And they must have been really hot. They must have been really rich. The corsets are so uncomfortable. So a lot of it ended up being me just kind of answering those misconceptions about historical dress. But I did try to highlight, like, these are images that we have locally, and this is like real stuff that people really wore to our real city. So this was the day I did a working day at my own library. You can see I have the dress over skirt drafted or draped at that point. And again, it was more people coming up and just asking, how did you get this idea? Why is this something that even occurred to you? Like, it wouldn't have occurred to me to do this. But there was a lot of good feedback. Like, everyone just really enjoyed coming up and like being able to see it in person and compare it to the image. So when I finished the dress, with the grant funds, I hired a professional photographer, and we went to the park, and like I said, we re-photographed the image. At this time, I forgot about this until like 2 weeks ago when I was talking to my coworker in the archive. At this point in time, this reservoir has an extra like iron bar thing around it, I guess, to keep people from touching this thing because it was damaged at one point. So my photographer luckily was able to, I think I like climbed under the bar and I got closer to it and she was able to Photoshop it out. Either that or I'm not sure exactly how she did it because I think she also, we took like 2 different ones and she might have mapped them together. So she was able to help me get it closer to the original one. Somehow you can see like the angle of the ironwork is different and I still have not been able to figure out if that's a difference in camera lenses because different camera lenses can really play with proportions like that, or if that was something where this was actually rebuilt at one point. I don't think it was. I think it's just a camera angle thing. So then after I finished the dress, I did 2 more presentations on it. This was at my library where I presented to the community about the entire project, how I had chosen the image, what the image means to Saratoga Springs, how I had remade the dress, and they were able to come up and see the whole finished garment and able to ask me questions. I think I was explaining the bustle at this point. I don't know, I look kind of sarcastic, but like, I don't remember the question, but I was explaining how the skirt is bustled in the back. Some of the things I was able to tell the community about is even right down to like when we look at the image, you can tell that her shadow is going this way. And we know, because I know Saratoga Springs, that the photographer was looking north through the park because I know what angle the photographer would have had to stand at. So we can tell from that this was taken in the morning because the sun would have been coming from the east. And I mean, it was fairly early in the morning, so she was probably out after breakfast, after her morning constitutional, and probably went to the park to take the waters and then walk around and do her little prescribed exercise, maybe after drinking what the doctor told her, you know, have 2 cups of the Colombian spring water and then walk twice around the park. So this is probably a morning walking dress that she was wearing, and we can use that to interpret maybe what materials it would have been made of. I forgot to mention, I dated this sometime around 1879 or so. Sometimes if I look at it really hard, it almost looks like the dress is collapsing a little in the back, which makes me wonder if it was slightly earlier and she just kept wearing it, because it would have been a very material heavy dress, which would have made it very expensive because it has so many pleats, it has so many layers. So if it was made a bit earlier, it would have had a little bit more of a bustle. And then once you get toward 1880, you get more into the natural form. So I'm wondering if she just kept wearing it and wore less of a bustle and it kind of flattened out a little in the back, but I might be reading a little too much into it. I was also lucky, I did a public presentation at the Clifton Park Public Library as well to follow up my public working day. And one of the local journalists came and she interviewed me for it. I don't think the video will play here because we're in the UK, but that was a screenshot of the video that she did. And I also, so at the end of the grant, luckily, because I did this all back in 2019, so I couldn't remember all of my specifics, but luckily I had to write a report for the end of the grant, so I was able to pull some of that to remind myself what to talk to you about. So like some of the community feedback, our Saratoga Springs city historian came to my presentation, and her kind of offhand comment was she felt like it was an important project for the community to try to connect them better to our history. And the local history museum and the local county historical society also, they picked up the news story that was shared on Facebook, and they shared it on their own pages saying that it was a really interesting local project. So there was community engagement from that. I didn't have a ton of turnout necessarily. In total, I had like 96 program attendees. And then I put the online engagements for the grant people, but we all know like 240 likes, comments, and shares is not that great, but like that's going to go in the grant report. And I also put my program expenses here The grant amount that I was awarded was $2,500 US, and the Saratoga Arts wanted me to put my artist fee in there. Obviously, that's like really inappropriate fee to pay someone who's sewing something this complicated. But it basically, the reason I went for the grant was because I knew the photography fee was going to be very expensive, and I knew the fabric was going to be very expensive, even though $316 for silk taffeta now is kind of laughable. But I wanted the help with the photographer fee, and I also knew that the reach that having the grant and having them behind me would get from the community was going to be much greater than what I could do on my own, and even just through my own library. So although I did this project with my library's materials, I did it as an individual. Like, I didn't do this on work time. This was my own outside of work thing. That there is this weird sort of overlap between me as a librarian and me as a costumer doing this project. But my boss was cool with it. It didn't cause any problems, so that was okay. And it has led to further things. This was supposed to happen in person, but of course you can see the date on there. We ended up doing a further instance of my presentation over Zoom with the local history center. And even after that, other like local history organizations kind of found out about me through it, and I've been doing further presentations with this gown. So this was one that I did at another state historic site where I kind of themed it around that Julian Fellows show, The Gilded Age, because that was filmed locally by us. So I developed a presentation where I slowly got dressed in the dress to explain the period attire to them. So it's kind of expanded to help other people connect to archives and to costuming in different ways. And yeah, I think that's it. The one thing I forgot to put on here was if you want to see the rest of my library's collection, we have digitized some of it. It's the Saratoga Springs Public Library in upstate New York. The URL is sspl.org. But yeah, feel free to email me any questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. So yeah, can I ask Caitlin, if I could just ask Becky and Ellie to come up as well. Come into the middle.
Oh yeah, the thing I forgot to say, if you've probably seen me around the last couple of days getting away. I've put the project I'm working on out if you want to come and have a little poke at it afterwards. I put that out just as an example of how this shift to knitting as a 3D object. You're perfectly welcome to like pick it up and have a look at how it's constructed. Like, you can't do anything to it that I can't undo.
So we've got a few minutes for questions, but also I'm keen, as Becky's saying, to leave a little bit of time for you to come and have a little look at the objects here as well, because Caitlin, you've got your dress there as well, so if you're happy for people to come and have a look, that'd be really lovely.
She came from the US to see you, so please.
Yeah. See that eclipse is different from Scotland.
So yeah, we have some time for questions. So yeah, we'll leave some time to come and have a look at that and ask any more questions that you've got. So can I have it to the others? Have you got any questions for our speakers? Oh, we've got the other. Go on, go for it.
I have a question for Becky.
Yeah.
Just what do you feel like is the best way to be able to translate any kind of research that people are doing to the online? So I know quite a few people that they've done loads of research, they've got loads of research, they want to share it with people, but they're not very online literate.
It's not an academic paper. As much as I love reading them, they are incredibly inaccessible for a lot of people. And we've heard all this speak about people who've got, YouTube channels, who've got Instagrams, who are like getting out there and sharing the research. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. For me, it was the blog post because I had the platform of the Women's Library and their promotion. And it was a one-off project. It wasn't an ongoing thing that I was doing. So it's very much going to vary from project to project. It might be your institutions, if you are an institution. It might be your institution's social media team. Go and talk to them. They love content. If you can give them content, they are over the moon. I've got a couple of mates who work in social media in various universities, and they will happily try and promote your work if you come and give it to them in a way that they can present in an accessible way to people.
Your kids grow on trees.
I was trying to find the Instagram.
Yeah, my PR coordinator at my library was like, send me the photo of you presenting. Do you want to put it on Facebook? And I was like, oh, I don't know, I'm not there representing the library, I don't know. But yeah, they love to put stuff online.
Any other questions?
Thank you all. This was wonderful. Really nice. We get to sort of almost end this weekend. I have a question for the three of you, which is what's next? I mean, I know that's cheeky, but yeah, what are you thinking? Either where you want to go with this project, or if you need a break from this project and you think, you know, what do you have your eyes on next? What's the, or at least thoughts? Anything? Sorry, I feel like I've asked a mean question.
No, it's a really good question. I'm trying not to like dominate because I know I'm quite a loud person. I was going to let one of the others go first.
So I'm currently going through all 1,400 of our stereo views, and first I was marking each one that like depicts a woman in costume or in dress, because I would like to pull those out at some point and do something with them. But through doing that, I realized that there is this one particular dress style, and I don't think it's the same woman in the same dress being photographed somehow in multiple spots in the city, but it's like maybe a couple different women in a very, very similar style dress, and I found like 8 of them, and I'm like, what is this dress? Where did they get the inspiration for this? Like, where's the fashion plate of this dress? Where's the pattern? And why are there so many of them? So I think at some point I'd like to do something with that.
Hunt that down.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm taking a break from like this side of things at the moment, but if I were to go back to it, I think I would maybe want to do like more like when children try on period clothing and heritage sites and things like that. Maybe with the same institutions.
Well, actually on Tuesday, I'm giving an expanded version of the paper I've just given you for the National Archives. So that's going to be fun for their methodology series. That's free to attend, and you can find that on their site if you want to come. I'm going to go a bit more into the context on that one. And then in October, actually, the yarn fair that I purchased the yarn from, for the pink jumper, I'm doing a talk for them. So you mentioned in the introduction, Life on and Off the Needle. So Women's Library does a thing called open archive sessions, which are meant to be, which are very informal. We just basically get a bunch of stuff out and say, hello, have a look. And obviously over lockdown that wasn't really feasible. So I got asked if I'd do an online one. So I wound up basically creating this interpretation of a few pieces that I really liked from the knitting collection. So I'm doing basically an updated version of that in October. And I don't know, there's loads of things I'd love to research, but I'm not sure the Women's Library for me is going to be the right context to do them. I think I need to, I'm not going anywhere with the library, but I think if I want to do more research into them, like I'd love to do something into cricket whites, which sounds like a really boring thing, but I just, yeah. Like the material history of girl guiding camp blankets, I think there's something there I'd really like to, so yeah, I've got quite a few places I could go next, but I don't know what they are yet. I actually have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It was sparked by this slide and going on to Instagram and trying to and now following you. How important has been not the kind of Facebook, Instagram, getting this material out is very visual. Video is really important, etc. How important has it been for all of you not just to disseminate, but also to learn and to create networks and to communicate and to do what you might call informal peer review of what works and what doesn't work, which is a very different kind of way of creating community from the way an academic might, do it within this building.
I mean, everything I know I learned from the internet. I think that sounds like an exaggeration, but I did not set out to be a costumer. I did not go to school for any kind of design or fashion. like I was an English major, and then I got my library master's, and that's where I am now. And I just do the sewing for fun, and it literally just started because I liked the challenge, and I started by reading blogs online, and then we all kind of moved to Instagram, and it's been just hours of reading people's blogs, looking at images on Tumblr, which is kind of now dead, now looking at the fashion plates that you can find on Pinterest. So everything I know, I'm self-taught and internet taught.
Yeah, I would say the same. Like, obviously, I'm coming from an academic point of view, so I've learned a lot about networking from that, but also networks like this, and also following people on Twitter and Instagram and blog posts.
I mean, what's been really interesting for me as a result of this, so I'd done all this work and then posted it, and then Dr. Del Patrick, who's one of the Glasgow Women's Library founders, read it and was so, I don't want to say she bounced up to me, because Adele doesn't really bounce, but like, you get what, yeah, she was very, very excited. Turns out, 20 years ago, she'd written about it in her PhD. That's why she brought in the entire bound copy of it for me to have a read through. So one of the things, but at the same time, like when I've done talks about women's creating and women's creation, it's the number of people that will want to share things with you. So Adele wanted to share, obviously, that she'd written about a pattern 20 years ago. But I mean, I had a potter come up to me at one event and say that she really resonated with this idea of thinking about it as a 3D object, because that's how she approaches her work. And obviously, anytime you're talking about knitting history, there's all the family stuff. So people want to tell you their stories and want to give you those histories. And yeah, that's just this constant thing of like, once you put it out there, people want to tell you other things as well about the subject. And I really love getting that as well, because, and I think specifically for knitting, it's so tied to ideas of domestic, even more so than any other type of clothes making. I actually have a question for Ellie.
Yeah.
So, was there anything you found about your costumers, is that the right word for it? Yeah. That you would say was uniquely Scottish in their approach?
I think...
or uniquely Scottish in the history that they were trying to tell?
So definitely the guy that I interviewed from History Matters Limited, he has like the Scottish coat of arms on his outfit, and he talks a lot about Braveheart, obviously, and says actually Robert the Bruce wasn't Australian, and he didn't walk around with blue face paint and etc. So especially
that
done
so much damage to Scottish history. Anyway.
It really has. And also with the Crannog Centre, I do have a picture of it, the tiny, tiny bit of cloth that was found from that time that they've actually reconstructed the clothing from. So that was found where they built the Crannog, rebuilt it. So I have that if anyone wants to see a picture.
With that, because we've literally got 5 minutes left in this panel. So what I'm going to do is actually stop the questions there and give us some time to come and have a look at the objects that you've brought you. So kindly brought. Before I let you go anywhere, we've got a little announcement that we've got a break coming up, but in room 2.35, which is in the corridor where the break room is, we've got Sarah modelling the mantua that the guys have been, it is the mantua, isn't it? Yeah, the mantua that's been in process for the past 4 days, so definitely worth a look. But can I just ask you to give a really big thank you to our 3 speakers? Thank you very much.
Yep, I'm just going to take my memory sit back. Yep. Fabulous.
Okay. Yeah. So,